David gently squeezed Amanda's hand under the table, offering silent reassurance as the weight of her father's words settled over the lavish dining room. The long mahogany table, set with fine china and sparkling silverware, suddenly felt suffocating. Mr. Wilson's gaze, cold and unwavering, bore into them both with an air of finality that Amanda had feared but hoped wouldn't come. Mrs. Wilson, seated beside her husband, nervously shifted in her chair, her eyes darting between Amanda and David. She had always been the quiet supporter in their household, hesitant to challenge her husband's authority. Amanda could see the tension in her mother's clenched fists resting lightly on the tablecloth. Her younger brother, Jack, stared down at his plate, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Amanda took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "David is a good man. He loves me and I love him. Isn't that what matters?" Mr. Wilson's jaw tightened, and he leaned back in his chair, swirling the glass of wine in his hand. "Love isn't enough, Amanda. There are expectations, traditions," he said, his voice laced with disappointment. "You don't understand what you're getting yourself into. Our family has a reputation to uphold." David, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, his voice steady and respectful. "Mr. Wilson, with all due respect, I understand your concerns. But my love for Amanda isn't about appearances. I've worked hard for everything I have, and I only want to build a future with her, one that's built on respect and love." Mr. Wilson scoffed, shaking his head dismissively. "You may think love is enough, but the world doesn't work that way." He looked at Amanda, his face hardening. "If you choose this path, you'll do it without my support." Amanda felt a lump rise in her throat, but she held her ground. "I won't choose between my family and the man I love, Dad. I shouldn't have to." A heavy silence hung in the air. Mrs. Wilson cleared her throat hesitantly. "Maybe we should all take some time to think this through," she suggested, offering a forced smile in an attempt to ease the tension. David nodded, standing up from the table with quiet grace. "I appreciate you inviting me tonight, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson," he said, his eyes meeting Amanda's with a silent promise that they would get through this together. As they left the estate, Amanda's mind raced. The confrontation she had dreaded had finally happened. But instead of feeling defeated, she felt a fire within her. She wasn't going to let her father's outdated beliefs dictate her future. As she walked hand in hand with David under the starry night sky, Amanda whispered, "This isn't over." David smiled, his eyes filled with hope. "No, it's not. We'll face this together." Tension in the Wilson household had reached a boiling point. Amanda tried to reason with her father every chance she got, pleading with him to see David for who he truly was. An honest, hard-working man who had built his career from scratch. She recounted David's achievements, his selfless dedication to the community, and the unwavering respect he had always shown her. But every conversation ended the same way. Mr. Wilson's voice, cold and unyielding, echoed through the halls of their grand estate. "Amanda, I won't allow this. You're risking everything for a man who doesn't belong in our world." Amanda's heart ached at his words, but she refused to back down. "Dad, love isn't about what you think is acceptable. David is a good man, and I love him. Why can't you see that?" Mr. Wilson's expression hardened. "If you choose him, you're choosing to walk away from everything we've given you. The family name, your financial stability, everything. I won't support this, and I certainly won't stand by while you throw your life away." Amanda stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a heavy storm. She had grown up in a world of comfort, surrounded by luxury, but she knew deep down that wealth meant nothing without love and happiness. With tears in her eyes, she made a decision that had been brewing in her heart for weeks. Later that evening, she packed her belongings into a suitcase, her hands trembling but determined. Her mother watched silently from the doorway, torn between loyalty to her husband and love for her daughter. "Are you sure about this, Amanda?" she asked softly. Amanda wiped her tears and nodded, Yes, Mom. I can't live in a home where love is conditional. She left the house that night, the weight of her father's ultimatum heavy in her chest, and made her way to David's modest apartment. The moment he opened the door and saw the suitcase in her hands, his eyes filled with concern. "Amanda," he whispered, stepping aside to let her in. "I couldn't stay there anymore," she said, trying to hold back the emotions threatening to spill over. "I chose us." David pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "We'll get through this," he promised, his voice filled with certainty. "We'll get through this," he promised, his voice filled with certainty. Love is worth it. As Amanda settled into her new life with David, the reality of her decision set in. The cozy apartment was a far cry from the lavish home she had left behind, but it was filled with warmth, laughter, and love. David's unwavering support and kindness reassured her every day that she had made the right choice. But the outside world wasn't as kind. The small town buzzed with whispers and gossip. Former friends who once admired her kept their distance, offering judgmental glances whenever they saw her in public. At the local grocery store, Amanda overheard a conversation between two women she had once considered close friends. "I can't believe she actually moved in with him," one whispered, shaking her head. "Her father must be devastated." "She's throwing her life away," the other added, her tone dripping with disdain. Amanda felt the sting of their words but held her head high, refusing to let their judgments shake her. She knew that love required sacrifice, and she was willing to endure the whispers and stares for the sake of the life she was building with David. Despite the challenges, David continued to be a beacon of strength and optimism. He worked tirelessly at his job, saving up to build a future for them. In the evenings, they volunteered at the community center, helping underprivileged kids with schoolwork and organizing food drives. Slowly, Amanda found purpose beyond the life she had left behind. Still, the distance between Amanda and her father remained a deep wound that refused to heal. Her mother called often, offering words of comfort, but never straying far from Mr. Wilson's firm stance. "Your father is stubborn," she would say. "But I know he loves you. I just wish he could see how happy I am," Amanda would reply, longing for the day when her father would finally put aside his prejudices and accept her choices. Then one evening, as Amanda and David sat on their small couch, watching a documentary about interracial couples and the challenges they faced, Amanda's phone buzzed. It was a text from her younger brother, Jack. "Dad's been quieter lately. He misses you, Amanda. I think deep down, he knows he was wrong." Amanda's heart skipped a beat. Could it be possible that her father was beginning to reconsider? She stared at the message, hope flickering in her chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, love really did have the power to change even the most stubborn hearts. Turning to David, she smiled softly. "Maybe this isn't the end after all," she whispered. David took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "Love always finds a way." Lying in the hospital bed, the beeping of the heart monitor echoing in the sterile room, Mr. Wilson blinked his eyes open to find an unexpected sight. David sitting beside him, holding out a glass of water with a steady hand and a warm, patient smile. "Here, Mr. Wilson," David said gently. "You've been out for a while. You should drink something." For a brief moment Mr. Wilson felt a surge of confusion and embarrassment. The last time he had seen David, it had been through a lens of prejudice and disapproval. And yet, here he was, showing him nothing but kindness in his most vulnerable moment. He took the glass hesitantly, their eyes meeting for the first time without hostility. "Thank you," he muttered, his voice hoarse, though it carried a weight of realization he wasn't quite ready to admit. Amanda, standing by the window with her mother, wiped her tear-streaked face, overwhelmed by the sight of David caring for the man who had shown him nothing but rejection. She had known David's heart was big, but watching him stay by her father's side, assisting the nurses, and offering comfort to her worried mother solidified the depth of his character. Over the next few days, David's presence at the hospital became constant. He helped Mrs. Wilson with the medical paperwork, reassured Amanda when her nerves got the best of her, and even took it upon himself to bring meals for the entire family. Every time Mr. Wilson opened his eyes, David was there, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. At first, Mr. Wilson remained guarded, his pride unwilling to give in, but he couldn't deny the small moments that chipped away at his stubbornness. Like when David effortlessly helped Amanda's mother carry a heavy bag of medication, or when he calmly reassured Mr. Wilson about his test results, explaining the medical terms with a level of understanding that impressed even the doctors. One afternoon, while Amanda was grabbing coffee and Mrs. Wilson had stepped out to make a phone call, Mr. Wilson and David found themselves alone. A heavy silence hung in the air before Mr. Wilson finally cleared his throat. You didn't have to stay here, you know," Mr. Wilson said, his voice laced with something that sounded almost like regret. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know," he replied simply. "How? I know," he replied simply, "but Amanda loves you, and that makes you family to me. And family takes care of each other." Mr. Wilson stared at him, seeing something in David's eyes that he hadn't allowed himself to see before. Integrity, kindness, and a strength of character that no amount of wealth could buy. Slowly, he nodded, the edges of his stern expression softening just a little. When Mr. Wilson was finally discharged, it was David who drove him home, helping him carefully settle into his armchair. And despite himself, Mr. Wilson found comfort in the way David managed everything with quiet efficiency, arranging follow-up appointments, adjusting his medication schedule, and fixing a loose cabinet door in the kitchen, all without being asked. Mrs. Wilson, who had always been more open-minded, watched in amazement as David's presence slowly began to feel less like an intrusion and more like a blessing. Even Amanda's younger brother, Jack, who had remained neutral throughout the ordeal, found himself seeking David's advice on school and life. Amanda watched it all unfold with a heart full of hope. Her father was beginning to see the man she loved, not as an outsider, but as someone who truly cared for their family. And while Mr. Wilson wasn't ready to verbalize his changing feelings just yet, Amanda could see it in the way his eyes followed David with a quiet sense of gratitude. One evening, as David was leaving after fixing a leaky pipe in the basement, Mr. Wilson called out to him. "David," he said gruffly. "Thank you for everything." David paused at the door, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Anytime, Mr. Wilson. Take care of yourself." As he watched David walk away, Mr. Wilson leaned back in his chair and sighed, realization dawning on him. Perhaps he had been wrong all along. As the sun cast long shadows across the porch, Mr. Wilson sat in his usual chair, gazing out at the neatly trimmed lawn. The late afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass, and for the first time in a long while, he felt tired. Not from age, but from the weight of his own stubbornness. He had spent years building a life based on certain values. But now, those values felt more like chains than foundations. David stepped onto the porch quietly, careful not to intrude, but Mr. Wilson noticed him right away. The two men sat in silence for a few moments, the sounds of birds chirping and distant cars filling the space between them. Finally, Mr. Wilson spoke, his voice softer than David had ever heard before. "You really love her, don't you?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if the answer would change everything. David, without hesitation, nodded. "With all my heart, sir. I only want the best for her, just like you do." Mr. Wilson turned slightly, his gaze meeting David's. There was something different in his expression. Not the usual guarded suspicion, but something closer to vulnerability. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt less awkward, more contemplative. "You know," Mr. Wilson finally said, his voice heavy with regret, "I wasn't always this way. When Amanda was born, I promised myself I'd protect her from anything that could hurt her. I thought that meant keeping her close, making sure she lived the life I envisioned for her." He sighed, rubbing his hands together as if trying to erase the years of rigid thinking. "I guess I never considered that love doesn't always fit into the neat little boxes we create." David listened, understanding that this moment, this honesty, was something Mr. Wilson wasn't used to giving freely. "Sir," David said gently, "I understand that you want to protect her. I want the same thing. I may not come from the same world you do, but I'll always work to give her the life she deserves. One filled with respect, kindness, and love." Mr. Wilson's lips pressed into a thin line, and he nodded slowly. "You've shown that more than I ever expected." He looked down at his hands, as if ashamed of his own past behavior. "I've been wrong, David. I let my pride and my fears get in the way of what truly matters." David offered a reassuring smile. "It's never too late to change, sir. Amanda loves you, and she wants you in her life. I do too." The older man's eyes welled with unshed tears, but he quickly blinked them away. "I don't deserve that kind of grace," he muttered. David chuckled softly. "Grace isn't something you earn, Mr. Wilson. It's something you give." For the first time in months, Mr. Wilson let out a small, genuine laugh. "Smart man," he said, shaking his head. "Amanda always did have good taste." David smiled, feeling the tension between them slowly dissolving. As they sat there, side by side, Mr. Wilson finally saw beyond his prejudices and into the heart of the man who had stood by Amanda, despite everything. Overwhelmed with emotion and regret, he realized that love wasn't defined by race or appearances. It was about respect, trust, and sincerity. He reached out a hand and David took it without hesitation. In that simple handshake, years of division melted away, replaced with a newfound understanding and acceptance. "I suppose I'd better start getting to know you properly?" Mr. Wilson said gruffly. But there was warmth in his voice. "I'd like that," David replied, knowing that the hardest battles were often fought within, and sometimes love had the power to win. A week after their conversation on the porch, Mr. Wilson took the first step in proving his sincerity. He extended an invitation to Amanda and David for dinner at the family home. This time, not as an interrogation, but as a chance to reconnect with an open heart. When Amanda and David arrived, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The tension that once filled the air had been replaced with warmth and cautious optimism. Mrs. Wilson greeted them with a genuine smile, and even Amanda's younger brother, Jack, seemed more at ease. Mr. Wilson, standing at the head of the dining room, extended his hand to David without hesitation. "Welcome," he said, his voice steady but filled with unspoken emotion. Dinner unfolded in a way Amanda had only dreamed of before. They shared stories, reminisced about Amanda's childhood, and even laughed over embarrassing family memories. Mr. Wilson, though still reserved, made an effort to ask David about his work and interests. And for the first time, Amanda saw a side of her father that gave her hope. One that was willing to grow and change. Halfway through the meal, Mr. Wilson set down his fork and cleared his throat, looking directly at Amanda and David. "I owe you both an apology," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his regret. "I let my fears and prejudices get in the way of seeing what truly matters. Amanda's happiness. And David, I misjudged you. I see now that you are exactly the kind of man I would want for my daughter." Tears welled in Amanda's eyes as she reached for David's hand under the table. David, humbled by the moment, nodded graciously. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." With time, Mr. Wilson not only accepted their relationship, but fully embraced David as part of the family. He began inviting David to family gatherings, seeking his advice on matters he once would have dismissed him from, and even sharing quiet moments of reflection about their past misunderstandings. When the day of Amanda and David's wedding arrived, Mr. Wilson stood proudly by Amanda's side, walking her down the aisle with a smile that spoke volumes. He shook David's hand firmly before taking his seat, beaming with pride as he watched them exchange vows. It was a moment of redemption, a testament to the power of love and forgiveness. Their story didn't just change their family, it rippled throughout the community. Friends and neighbors who once whispered about their relationship now spoke of it with admiration, inspired by the transformation they had witnessed. Amanda and David's journey proved that love could conquer prejudice, and that change was always possible when hearts were willing to listen and grow. As they danced together at the reception, Amanda looked into David's eyes and whispered, "We did it." David smiled, pulling her close. "We did."